In the autumn of 1944, a German officer captured near Aachen was asked by his American interrogator what had surprised him most about fighting the United States Army. He had expected to be asked about equipment, about the Sherman tank, which he considered inferior to the Panther, about American artillery, which he considered formidable, about American air power, which he considered decisive. He was not asked about equipment. He thought for a moment, and then he said something the interrogator wrote down and that appeared in a military intelligence summary circulated to senior American commanders. He said that what surprised him most was the shaving. Not the fighting, not the tactics, not the logistics, the shaving. The American soldiers he had observed were shaving every morning, on the front line, in foxholes, in conditions the German military tradition considered incompatible with personal hygiene. Razors and soap and mirrors used before combat the same way they were used before a normal day. To a professional German officer who had spent 4 years in armies where such things were considered field luxuries, this was deeply confusing. He could not fit it into a category his training had given him. A soldier who shaves on the front line is either a soldier who does not understand the gravity of his situation, or a soldier whose relationship to military life is so fundamentally different from anything the Prussian tradition has produced that the observer has no framework for interpreting the behavior. The German officer filed it in the category of things he did not understand. He noted that the Americans also carried photographs of their families, that they wrote and received letters at a frequency German soldiers in similar positions did not, that they had, and this appeared in multiple German intelligence assessments, a quality the reports described as informality that did not appear to reduce their effectiveness in combat. This last observation was the one that mattered. The German military tradition held a specific theory of what made soldiers effective. The theory was built on the systematic removal of civilian identity. A soldier was not a civilian in uniform. He had left behind the habits, the comforts, the emotional attachments, and the individuality of civilian life, and replaced them with the discipline, the obedience, and the collective identity of the military unit. This transformation was not incidental to military effectiveness. It was, in Prussian doctrine, the foundation of it. You could not fight effectively if you were still, in some part of yourself, the man who had a wife in Hamburg, and a job in a factory, and a photograph on the wall. That man had interests that conflicted with military effectiveness. He wanted to survive. He wanted to go home. He had a stake in his own continued existence that created a friction against the willingness to die that warfare required. Strip away the civilian, train the soldier obeys, the soldier fights, the soldier dies when dying is what the mission requires. The Americans had not stripped away the civilian, they had brought him to the front, and they were winning. The German officer filed it in the category of things he did not understand. His training had not given him a framework for it. The Prussian tradition had assumed the opposite so completely that the question had never been formally asked. In 1941, the United States Army asked it, not because the Army had a theory about civilian identity and combat effectiveness, because the Army had hired a sociologist from the University of Chicago named Samuel Stouffer and told him to find out what American soldiers actually thought and what kept them fighting and whether any of it could be measured. Stouffer began his first survey on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. By the end of the war, he had surveyed more than 500,000 American soldiers. The results were not what the Army had expected. They were also not what the German officers watching Americans shave in foxholes had expected. Samuel Stouffer was not a military man. A sociologist from Sac City, Iowa, who had spent his career developing survey research methods at the University of Chicago. He believed human behavior could be measured, attitudes quantified, and that the answers to how people actually functioned, as opposed to how institutions assumed they functioned, were available if you asked the right questions. The United States Army in 1941 was built on assumptions about how soldiers functioned that no one had tested empirically. Inherited from European military tradition and the First World War. Held with the confidence of things that everyone knows without anyone having verified. The Army knew soldiers fought for abstract ideals. democracy, freedom, country. The Frank Capra films, the recruiting posters, the speeches, all built on this assumption. Stouffer's surveys showed this was wrong. Not completely wrong, but not the primary driver. The surveys showed that abstract ideology was, in the ranking of factors that motivated combat performance, surprisingly low. What kept men fighting was not democracy, it was not wanting to let their buddies down. This finding, documented with the rigor of men who understood they were contradicting institutional assumptions and needed the data to be unimpeachable, had implications the Army did not fully absorb and that military historians have been writing about since. The primary unit of combat motivation is the small group, not the nation, not the ideology, not the abstract cause. The specific men, known by name and face and habit, who would be disappointed or endangered if the soldier failed. A soldier fights because his sergeant is watching, because the man in the next foxhole is counting on him, because the relationships formed over weeks and months of shared hardship create obligations more compelling in the moment of combat than any flag or principle. The Wehrmacht had developed its replacement system specifically to maintain unit cohesion, sending men from the same region to the same units so the small group remained intact. The bonds that made it functional were not destroyed by an anonymous replacement pipeline. But the German understanding was built on the Prussian theory, men stripped of civilian identity and reforged as soldiers. The unit was cohesive because its members had all undergone the same transformation. The shared identity was military. Stouffer found something different in the American data. The old line senior officers were initially hostile. They feared asking soldiers their opinions would put rebellious ideas in their heads. The surveys went ahead anyway, backed by General Marshall, who understood data was more useful than assumption. The American soldier had not been stripped of civilian identity. He was, explicitly and by his own understanding, a civilian temporarily in uniform. The surveys were full of this, men who described themselves as doing a job that needed to be done and intended to go back to their real lives when it was over. Men who maintained their civilian habits, their civilian relationships, their civilian sense of themselves. And those men, the ones who maintained the strongest connections to their civilian lives, who wrote and received the most letters, who kept the photographs and personal objects that tied them to who they were before the war, were not worse soldiers. They were better ones. Not in every individual case, but in the aggregate, across the 500,000 surveys, the pattern was consistent. The soldier who had not lost himself in the transformation to military identity was more resilient, more motivated, and more effective in sustained combat than the soldier who had. The German officer watching Americans shave in foxholes had identified the right observation. He had drawn the wrong conclusion. The shaving was not evidence of soldiers who did not understand where they were and had decided to remain the people they had been before they got there. To maintain, under conditions designed to strip everything away, the habits that connected them to their civilian selves. This was not weakness. It was the thing that kept them fighting. The German soldier who went to war in 1939 carried with him something that the Prussian tradition had spent 3 centuries trying to minimize. He carried his civilian self. Not openly, not with institutional support, but in the letters he wrote home, subject to censorship, read by officers, stripped of anything classifiable as defeatist. The civilian self appeared consistently and with a clarity that censors could not fully remove without removing the letters entirely. Konrad Jurausch was a high school teacher of religion and history who served in a reserve battalion in Poland and Russia. He wrote letters to his wife Elizabeth throughout his service. He died of typhoid in Russia in 1942. His letters, preserved by his family, eventually published by his son, are one of the most complete records of what an ordinary German soldier thought and felt. What Jurausch wrote about, in letter after letter, was the gap between who he had been and what the war required him to become. He wrote about his students, his teaching, the daily rhythms of life organized around education and family. Not as nostalgia, or not only as nostalgia, but as the vocabulary he had for describing who he was. The civilian self was not something he had left behind. It was the frame through which he interpreted everything happening to him. It was also the source of his moral unease. A soldier who has fully completed the Prussian transformation does not experience moral unease at the things soldiers are required to do. That is the point. The transformation produces a man whose judgments about right and wrong are organized around military necessity, not civilian ethics. Jarausch had not completed the transformation. He was still, in some essential part of himself, a school teacher who believed what school teachers believe in. What he was witnessing in Russia, the treatment of prisoners, the gap between the war he had been told he was fighting and the war he was actually fighting, created a cognitive dissonance his letters document with painful honesty. He was not typical. Most German soldiers were more fully formed by the military culture, more able to maintain the separation between what they saw and what they felt. But the capacity for moral unease, the civilian self that could observe and find it wrong, was present in German soldiers too. Jarausch's letters reveal it because he was unusually articulate. The secretly recorded conversations of German POWs, discovered decades later in British and American archives, reveal it because the men speaking did not know they were being recorded. 150,000 pages of secretly recorded conversations, German soldiers talking among themselves with a frankness their letters never achieved, about what they had done, about their doubts, about the gap between what they had been told and what they had experienced. The civilian self was there. It had never fully disappeared. The Wehrmacht had built an institutional structure that suppressed it, treated its expression as weakness, had no mechanism for acknowledging it except in conversations between men who believed they were not being overheard. The American army had built the opposite. It had hired Samuel Stouffer to ask the soldiers what they thought. It had published monthly reports called What the Soldier Thinks and sent them up the chain of command. It had treated the inner life of the civilian in uniform not as a liability to be managed, but as data to be understood and, where possible, supported. This was not idealism, it was pragmatism. The Army had discovered, through Stouffer's surveys, that the soldier who maintained his civilian connections fought better. And so the Army supported those connections, not out of sentimentality, out of the recognition that sentimentality, in this specific context, was operationally useful. The mail system was not incidental infrastructure, it was a strategic investment. V-mail, a photographic system that reduced letters to microfilm for transport, allowed millions of letters per week between American soldiers and their families. The average American soldier in Europe received more mail more frequently than any comparable force in history. The Germans were watching Americans shave and writing reports about informality that did not appear to reduce combat effectiveness. The Americans were writing home. The photograph was not a luxury. This is the thing the German officers did not understand when they wrote in their reports about the personal items GIs carried into combat. The photographs of families, the letters from home, the comic books, the small objects, a baseball, a harmonica, a St. Christopher medal, that had no military utility and added weight to a soldier's kit. The German military tradition had a clear answer: they should not. A soldier carries what he needs to fight. Anything beyond the necessary minimum is weight, distraction, evidence of a soldier who has not fully committed to his role. The American Army had a different answer. It had arrived at this answer not through philosophy, but through data. Stouffer's surveys asked soldiers what kept them going in combat. Not abstract, not "what are you fighting for?" but specific. What, in the moment when continuing seemed impossible, made you continue? The most common answer, expressed in dozens of formulations across hundreds of thousands of surveys: I thought about the people waiting for me at home. I thought about my wife, my kids, my mother. I kept going because I couldn't stand the thought of them being told I gave up. The photograph was not decoration, it was a weapon, not metaphorically, operationally. The soldier who could look at a photograph and access the emotional reality of the people he was fighting to return to, that soldier had a resource the soldier without the photograph did not have. The German military tradition had stripped away the photograph because it represented the civilian self that the military identity was supposed to replace. A soldier who is thinking about his wife is not fully committed to his mission. He has a competing interest. He wants to survive. He is fighting, partly, for a specific woman in a specific house in a specific town. This was, in Prussian theory, a weakness. Stouffer's data showed it was a strength. Not unlimited strength, but in the specific, documented correlation between soldiers who maintained strong civilian connections, who received frequent letters, kept personal photographs, were encouraged to sustain emotional ties, and soldiers who performed better in sustained combat, the data was consistent. The research branch had enough data to demonstrate it across theaters, across units, across demographics. The pattern held. There was a German word, Heimweh, with no precise English equivalent. Homesickness. The German military treated it as a problem to be managed. Evidence of a soldier who had not fully separated from civilian life. Something to suppress. The American system treated it as information. A signal that the connection the soldier was missing was exactly the connection that, properly maintained, would keep him fighting. So the Army maintained it. Mail delivery to American forces in Europe was prioritized at a level that military logisticians in any other army would have considered extravagant. When supply lines were stretched, when fuel and ammunition competed with everything else for limited transport capacity, the V-mail kept moving. The numbers make the priority concrete. In 1944, the Army Postal Service processed more than 2.5 billion pieces of mail. Letters, packages, and V-mail moving between American soldiers and the people at home who were, according to Stouffer's data, the reason those soldiers were still fighting. This was not the support structure of an army that had decided its soldiers needed to be separated from their civilian selves. It was the support structure of an army that had decided its soldiers' civilian selves were the most important asset it had. Because Marshall's army had asked what actually kept soldiers fighting, the answer was not in the field manual, it was in the photograph in the soldier's breast pocket. The German officer who wrote about American informality that did not appear to reduce combat effectiveness had observed something real and had not understood what he was seeing. He was seeing the mechanism, the shaving, the letters, the photographs, the comic books, the harmonica. These were not evidence of soldiers who did not understand where they were. They were the reason those soldiers were still there. In June 1942, the United States Army published the first issue of a magazine called Yank. The decision to create Yank was, by the standards of German military institutional logic, inexplicable. Yank was written by enlisted men. Its content was explicitly beyond the editorial control of commissioned officers, a condition established at the directive of the Secretary of War. Soldiers could air grievances in its letters section. Its cartoonists, staff sergeants, and corporals could satirize military life, give voice to the frustrations of men who had been pulled from their civilian lives and placed in uniform. The German military had no equivalent. The Wehrmacht had propaganda. It had the official channels through which the regime's narrative reached soldiers. It had censored letters and monitored communications and the systematic suppression of information that might undermine morale. It had the institutional machinery for telling soldiers what to think. What it did not have was a magazine run by enlisted men that allowed soldiers to complain in print about the food, satirize their officers, and publish cartoons that made fun of the Army to the Army's own face. Yank's most popular feature was a comic strip called Sad Sack, drawn by Sergeant George Baker, a hapless private navigating the absurdity of military life with the resignation of a man who had been a civilian recently enough to remember that things could be otherwise. Sad Sack was wildly popular because it was accurate. It said, in the language of satire, the things soldiers felt and were not supposed to say. The German military had a word for what Sad Sack represented: defeatism. In German institutional logic, Sad Sack should not have existed. If it had, it would have been suppressed. Soldiers who read it and identified with it would have been considered, by Wehrmacht standards, soldiers whose military identity was insufficiently formed. The American Army had a different theory. Bill Mauldin was 23 years old when his cartoon strip Willie and Joe began appearing in Stars and Stripes. Unshaven, exhausted infantrymen navigating the machinery of war with the weariness of men who had been at it long enough to have no illusions left. Mauldin drew from life, embedded with the troops he drew. When Patton saw the strip, he threatened to ban it. Eisenhower overruled him. Willie and Joe were popular for the same reason Sad Sack was popular. They told the truth. The truth was dark and funny, and the men reading the strip recognized themselves in it. The Yank editorial board, operating without officer oversight, publishing what soldiers wanted to read, allowing enlisted men to be honest about their experience, was not undermining the Army. It was sustaining it. The soldier who could read Sad Sack and laugh at the absurdities of military life was a soldier who had not been broken by those absurdities. He had a framework for processing the gap between the Army's self-image and his daily experience, humorous rather than despairing, acknowledging reality without making it unbearable. The German soldier who had no sanctioned outlet for the frustrations of months in the field accumulated a burden that the American soldier was allowed to discharge through laughter. Stouffer's surveys documented this too. Soldiers who felt they could complain, who felt their grievances were heard, who had access to the informal communications culture that Yank represented, those soldiers had substantially better morale. The institutional implication was the same one the German military had never absorbed. The soldier who maintains the civilian's right to complain, to satirize, to acknowledge that things could be better, that soldier is not weaker than the soldier who has abandoned civilian identity. He is stronger. Because the thing he is protecting, the world where Sad Sack is funny because it's true, where you can write a letter home about the bad food, where you can carry a photograph of your wife and nobody calls it weakness, that world is the world he is fighting for. He is fighting to go back to it. The German soldier had been told to fight for the Reich. The American soldier was fighting to go home. One of those motivations, Stouffer's data showed, sustains combat effectiveness over the long duration of a war. The other one, the 150,000 pages of secretly recorded German prisoner conversations show, eventually breaks down. The breakdown did not happen all at once. It happened the way institutional assumptions fail, gradually, then suddenly, in ways the institution could not acknowledge because acknowledging them would require acknowledging that the assumption had been wrong. The assumption had been validated repeatedly in the early years of the war. The Wehrmacht of 1939 to 1941 was the most formidable tactical fighting force in the world. The Prussian tradition had produced what it was designed to produce. The problem was duration. The Prussian system had been designed for wars that ended. Frederick the Great's wars had been short by modern standards. Even the First World War had lasted 4 years, brutal but finite. The Second World War asked something different. It asked men to sustain military identity and effectiveness across years of continuous combat in conditions that had no precedent in the traditions that had trained them. The Eastern Front was where the German system first encountered its limits. By winter 1941 and 1942, German soldiers trained to suppress their civilian selves, to replace personal identity with military identity. Those soldiers were encountering conditions the military identity could not process. The cold, the distances, the absence of any end in sight. The gap between what they had been told, a short campaign home by Christmas, and a war that appeared to have no horizon, in a country that appeared to have no limit, against an enemy that appeared to have no end. The civilian self, suppressed but not destroyed, began to reassert itself, not as strength, not as the functional connection to home that Stouffer identified in the American data, but as longing, as Heimweh, as the weight of everything left behind and possibly never to be returned to. The 150,000 pages of secretly recorded prisoner conversations document this progression with the precision of an archive never meant to be read. German soldiers in British and American camps, talking among themselves, not knowing they were being recorded, saying the things they could not say in censored letters. They talked about home, about their families, about the lives they had left and were not sure they would recover. They talked about doubt, not abstract doubt, the specific accumulated doubt of men who had been told the civilian self was weakness, had suppressed it for years, and were now in captivity, discovering that what they had suppressed had not gone away. It had just been waiting. The American soldier in the same camps behaved differently, not better, differently. The American soldier in captivity was still, visibly, a civilian, still the man who had been a truck driver in Indiana, or a teacher in Ohio, or a student from Texas. He maintained the habits the German officer had identified as informal, the insistence on his own identity, the maintenance of individual personality, the refusal to disappear entirely into a collective military role. This was not stubbornness, it was resilience. The civilian identity that the Prussian tradition treated as an obstacle to military effectiveness was also, in the specific conditions of extended captivity and sustained combat, a resource. The man who knew who he was before the war knew who he would be after it. The man whose entire identity had been the mission, who had suppressed the civilian self so thoroughly that the military self was all that remained, had nothing to return to when the mission failed. The German soldier who broke in captivity was not weaker than the American who did not. He had been trained more thoroughly. He had removed more of himself in the service of the institution. He had done exactly what the Prussian tradition had asked him to do. And that was why he broke. The American soldier had never fully removed the civilian, had carried him through combat in a breast pocket photograph, and a V-mail letter, and a sad sack cartoon in a magazine run by sergeants. Had been told by an institution that hired a sociologist to find out what actually worked. The civilian self was not an obstacle to military effectiveness. It was the reason for it. The German officer watching Americans shave on the front line had called it weakness. He had been watching the strongest thing in the American army. The United States Army did not stumble into the understanding that civilian identity was a military asset. It was built deliberately, through a process the institution itself found uncomfortable, by men who had decided that the question of what actually kept soldiers fighting was more important than the answer the existing doctrine assumed. Marshall commissioned Stouffer in 1941. The institutional decisions that followed, the V-mail system, the Yank magazine, the USO, the Army Special Services that provided entertainment and recreation to troops in the field, were the product of a theory of the soldier that was, in every important way, the opposite of the Prussian theory. The Prussian theory: strip away the civilian, build the soldier. The American theory: the civilian is the soldier. The habits, the connections, the personal identity that the civilian brings to uniform. These are not obstacles to military effectiveness. They are its foundation. This theory was counterintuitive to every professional military man inside an institution built on Prussian assumptions. The old line generals who resented Stouffer's surveys were not wrong to find them threatening. They contradicted the assumptions those generals had organized their careers around. Marshall referred to the American soldier as the first quantitative studies of the mental and emotional life of the soldier. He commissioned it not out of sentimentality, but out of the belief that understanding what actually drove soldier behavior was more militarily useful than maintaining the comfortable fiction that doctrine was correct. The Army had built a system that treated its soldiers' complaints as information rather than insubordination, that treated their need for mail from home as a strategic priority rather than a sentimental indulgence, that produced a magazine run by enlisted men explicitly beyond the editorial control of officers. This was not the behavior of an institution that had decided the civilian self was the problem. It was the behavior of an institution that had decided the civilian self was the solution. The USO was established in 1941 to provide entertainment and recreation to military personnel. By 1944, it was operating more than 3,000 clubs worldwide. Bob Hope performed for troops in the Pacific, in Europe, in the most remote theaters of the war. Not as a bonus, but as a systematic, institutionalized acknowledgement that soldiers needed to be reminded of what they were fighting for. Not in the abstract, in the specific. A Bob Hope show was not a speech about democracy. It was a comedian telling jokes that sounded like the jokes you heard before the war in the America you were fighting to return to. A reminder, delivered in the specific language of American popular culture, that the civilian world still existed and was waiting. The German military had no USO equivalent, not because German soldiers didn't need it. The secretly recorded prisoner conversations make clear that German soldiers were hungry for the same connection to civilian life. The difference was institutional. The Wehrmacht had built itself around the theory that the soldier should not need that connection, that the need itself was weakness. The American Army had built itself around the data that showed the opposite. And so, on a specific night in 1944, on a stage somewhere in the Pacific or in Europe, Bob Hope walked out in front of 10,000 American soldiers and made them laugh. The laughter was not incidental. It was the sound of 10,000 men remembering who they were, which was, according to Samuel Stouffer's 500,000 surveys, the sound of 10,000 men finding a reason to keep fighting. The German military, watching American USO operations with the professional attention of men who knew they were fighting a different kind of army, filed reports about American entertainment infrastructure. The reports noted its scale and reach. They noted, with the specific frustration of men whose institutional framework had no category for what they were observing, that it did not appear to reduce combat effectiveness. It appeared to increase it. The German officer captured near Aachen in the autumn of 1944 was not the only German professional soldier who had observed American informal habits and tried to make sense of them. The interrogation reports and prisoner conversations document the same pattern, the same observation, the same confusion, and, in the accounts of officers who survived long enough to reflect, the same gradual revision of the initial assessment. The initial assessment was always some version of, "These men are not soldiers. They are civilians in uniform, sloppy, informal, resistant to discipline, insufficiently committed to the military identity that effective fighting requires." The revision came later, in captivity, in post-war memoirs, or in the specific moment when the officer who had filed the report about American informality discovered that the informal soldiers were fighting with a tenacity his theory did not predict. The tenacity was not the surprise. German officers had expected American bravery. Americans were large, healthy, well-fed, and motivated by something the German reports consistently struggled to define: an aggression that was personal rather than institutional, emerging from the individual rather than from the military identity the institution had installed. One German officer, debriefed after the war, described American soldiers in combat as men fighting as if the war were an inconvenience imposed on people who had somewhere else to be. He did not mean this as a compliment. He had come to understand over the course of the war that it was the most accurate description of the most dangerous kind of soldier, a man who intends to survive, has someone waiting for him, and will remove whatever is in the way of his return. What surprised the German officers was the resilience, not the bravery of men who charge once and take a position, the resilience of men pushed back, who reorganize without orders and come back, who take casualties that in German doctrine would justify withdrawal and keep fighting. Not because American soldiers were better at accepting casualties. The American replacement system, sending individual men to units rather than reconstituting units together, actually damaged the small group cohesion Stouffer's research showed was the primary driver of combat motivation. The resilience came from somewhere else. It came from the specific quality the German officers had been calling weakness. The soldier who is still, in some part of himself, the man he was before the war, who carries the photograph, writes the letters, reads the sad sack cartoon, shaves every morning because that is what he did at home. That soldier has a reason to continue that is not dependent on the military situation. The civilian identity did not run the mathematics. The civilian identity said, "I have to get home. The people in that photograph are waiting. I cannot be the one who stopped." This motivation was not in the field manual, not the product of military training. It was what Stouffer had found in 500,000 surveys. American soldiers fought not for the army, not for the flag, not for the abstract ideals the propaganda apparatus invoked. They fought for the specific people they were going back to. The photograph was the reason. The letter was the reason. The shaving was the soldier telling himself every morning that the normal life was still real, still waiting, still worth returning to. The German officer who had called it weakness had identified, without understanding, the core of what he was fighting. He had looked at the photograph in the American soldier's breast pocket and seen a civilian who did not belong at the front. He had been looking at the reason the front would not stop moving. The German army that fought the Second World War was, by almost every technical measure of military effectiveness, a better army than the one it lost to. This is not a controversial claim. Military historians who have compared casualty exchange ratios, unit performance under pressure, tactical flexibility, and small unit initiative consistently find the same result. German units, man for man, inflicted more casualties than they sustained. German tactical performance exceeded that of their Allied opponents through most of the war. The Wehrmacht was better trained, better officered at the small unit level, more cohesive in the specific sense that its replacement system built and maintained the small group bonds that Stouffer would identify as the primary driver of combat motivation. It also lost. The explanation military historians find most uncomfortable is the simplest. The Wehrmacht lost because Germany could not match American production, could not replace its losses, could not sustain a two-front war against adversaries whose industrial capacity dwarfed its own. This explanation is correct. It is also incomplete. It treats the war as a problem of arithmetic: more tanks, more planes, more men, and misses the specific quality that made American arithmetic so difficult to overcome. The American army was not just more numerous, it was more resilient. Its soldiers reorganized under fire, improvised in the absence of orders, took casualties that German doctrine defined as combat ineffective levels, and kept advancing. And when German tactical excellence achieved a local victory, pushed a unit back, destroyed a position, the American army reconstituted and came back. Not because American soldiers were braver, not because they were better trained, because they had somewhere to go back to. The photograph in the breast pocket, the letter from home, the sad sack cartoon in the magazine the Army had decided to publish because a sociologist from Iowa had found, in 500,000 surveys, that the civilian self was not an obstacle to military effectiveness. It was the engine of it. The German military had spent 300 years building the theory that the soldier must be separated from the civilian, that the civilian self, with its personal loyalties, its individual identity, its stubborn insistence on surviving and returning, was a liability that military training existed to overcome. Samuel Stouffer had spent 4 years building the data that showed the theory was wrong. Not wrong everywhere, wrong specifically, measurably, in the conditions of the Second World War. A war fought by citizen armies across years of sustained combat in which the question of what kept men fighting was not answered by ideology or institutional identity, but by the specific, personal, civilian connections that men carried into combat. The German soldier who had suppressed his civilian self found, in the winter of 1941, that the military self could not sustain him indefinitely. The mission had no end. The Heimweh the institution had taught him to suppress became, in the absence of any other source of meaning, the dominant force in his psychology. The American soldier who had carried his civilian self to the front, in a photograph, in a letter, in the daily habit of shaving, had a resource the German soldier did not have. He knew who he was before the war. He knew who he would be after it. He knew, with the specific certainty of a man who has someone waiting for him, that there was an after it. This was not sentiment. This was strategy. The American Army had made its strategy deliberately through the V-mail system and the Yank magazine and the USO and the 500,000 surveys commissioned by a general who understood that the question of what actually kept soldiers fighting was more important than the answer doctrine assumed. Marshall had understood what the German military tradition had not, that the photograph is not weakness, that the photograph is why. The German officers who wrote reports about American informality that did not reduce combat effectiveness were watching a theory in action that their training had not given them the framework to understand. The theory was not in the German field manual. It was in the 500,000 surveys, in the V-mail, in the sad sack cartoon, in the Bob Hope show, in the breast pocket of every American soldier who had carried a photograph of the people he was going back to. The German officer captured near Aachen went home after the war. He had been a professional soldier for most of his adult life. He had served in Poland, France, Russia, and the West. He had watched the Wehrmacht perform with the precision and effectiveness that 300 years of Prussian tradition had designed it to produce. He had watched it lose. He did not find this easy to explain. The Wehrmacht had been a better army. He knew this with professional certainty. Better trained, better disciplined, more effective at the tactical level where individual soldiers and small units determined whether positions were taken or held. And yet, In the post-war years, German officers produced a remarkable body of memoir literature. Remarkable not for its honesty about atrocity, most memoirs avoided that, but for its honesty about military failure. The officers who had fought against the Americans wrote with a professional candor that the war had made impossible. What they wrote returned consistently to the same observations the interrogation reports had captured: the informality, the personal habits, the maintenance in conditions the German military tradition considered incompatible with effective combat of the civilian self. And they wrote, the most honest of them, about the discovery made too late, that the informal soldiers were better at one specific thing than the formally trained soldiers found wanting against them. They were better at continuing, not at initiating, not at technical execution, not at the small unit performance that German training excelled at producing, at continuing, at finding, in conditions that had eliminated every other source of motivation, a reason to keep going. The reason was in the breast pocket. Samuel Stouffer published The American Soldier After the War, 2 volumes, more than 1,500 pages, the most comprehensive study of combat motivation ever undertaken. Marshall described it as the first quantitative studies of the mental and emotional life of the soldier. It changed how the American military thought about its soldiers. Not immediately, not completely. Institutions absorbed challenges to their assumptions slowly. But the shift had already happened, not in post-war conferences and revised doctrine, but on the front lines, in the V-mail system and the Yank magazine and the 3,000 USO clubs, in the razor that an American soldier had used that morning in a foxhole in France. The German officers who had watched American soldiers and called them civilians in uniform had been more right than they knew. That was the point. The American soldier was a civilian in uniform. A truck driver from Indiana who intended to go back to driving trucks. A teacher from Ohio who intended to go back to teaching. A student from Texas who intended to go back to school. He had not left his civilian self behind. He had brought it with him, maintained it under fire, protected it against the institutional pressures that in every other army would have stripped it away. And that civilian self, the specific, personal, unglamorous civilian self, with its photographs and its letters and its daily habits and its stubborn refusal to stop being what it had been before the uniform, was the reason the front kept moving. Not the tanks, not the air power, not the logistics. All of those things mattered. The arithmetic was decisive, but the arithmetic required men who kept moving, and the men kept moving because they were still, underneath the uniform, the men who had a reason to. The German army trained its soldiers to leave their civilian lives behind. It called this discipline. The American soldier carried his civilian life into combat. His photographs, his comics, his letters, his toothbrush. The German officers who watched this called it weakness. They were watching the reason they lost.